to perplex is a term from Veritas, but it's the ability to say, I've got a mirror here, but please use this side of it as much as possible and only use the other side when you've really got to write data. So, for example, you direct all your reads to a mirror side that's local, but you're actually not then sending any reads across to a mirror side that might be a kilometre away across an expensive link. So that's a sort of example for that. And I heard a comment that that's been done on the FreeBSD side, but it's not yet in the OpenZFS. Right, again, I'll move on quickly. Multi-tenancy. So there's a few features here. Per zone I/O resource scheduling and per zone ARC resource controls. These are all geared around systems that got multi-tenancy. You've got zones perhaps that belong to different companies. You don't want one company hammering away at their zone and killing the rest of the system. But as far as possible, you want other companies that are using different zones not to be able to even see what load that is going on across the other tenants on the system. So the ability to specify limits on things like IOPS zone or the amount of ARC that's used by a particular zone. And also looking at things to prevent actual denial of service. So you might do some nasty things in the zone, like if you get, zone administrators probably got the ability to create snapshots and create file systems. Well, they might go away and create 1 million of them. And actually that then creates issues when you try and import that pool next time. It'll take a long time to import. So some controls there that limit the number of snapshots and clones that you can create below certain points in the file system. Another one is if you're doing a ZFS receive. The ZFS receive kind of assumes a little bit that it's got a valid stream coming into it. And there have been cases where you could send data in that would actually cause panics. Well, that's kind of being tightened up there so that you can send any old rubbish in, but it's safe from the system's point of view, you're not panicking the system. So that's important for a tenant that doesn't have any old rubbish in, or corrupted data stream. Platforms. So I've talked a little bit about most of these. Obviously the Lumos one is historically is the one that's kind of got the code base that's furthest ahead. That's not true in all aspects of the ZFS code because it's not all yet been contributed back. That's a kind of ongoing process. But in terms of the other platforms, FreeBSD is very, very mature and pretty much in sync with the Lumos. There are a few things that are not, like the specification of A shift on for creating 4K block size pools. And that's just because people are still trying to work out the best way of doing that. Bearing in mind, as I said, A shift is really per VDEV, not a per pool parameter. The Linux port is much newer in comparison. It seems to be quite mature. There are design issues with things like using large memory applications in kernel. And obviously ZFS is a kind of a kernel-based application that, if you're using it purely as a file server, expects to be using all of the memory. But large memory allocations are something they're sort of thinking about how to handle better inside ZFS.
That's mostly, I've talked with the guys, especially with Richard, and it's mostly a problem with 32-bit Linux. So it's not a big problem with 64 bits, but if you're trying to run it like on your Raspberry Pi or some very limited platform, the 1 gigabyte VM cap on Linux on 32 bits will hit you.
Okay.
Badly. And that's also why they're having trouble with 128K blocks.
So Brian,
so the case with the 64-bit Linux, you don't have problems with those bigger than 120K as well?
Well, no, I mean generally ZFS is kind of VM happy, and it likes to gobble up as much memory as you give it. And
well, as much as it can.
Yes, and that then, and since it's much of ZFS is run as a sort of a kernel process or a kernel thread, you do get issues when you hit the 1 gigabyte VM kernel VM cap. So you got to sort of squeeze underneath that somehow. And what if your ARC's bigger than that? Well, then the Linux kernel then sort of tries to get around that using various PAE mechanisms, especially in the page cache. ZFS kind of does its own thing, and it's not really optimized for that.
But on 64-bit Linux, it's fine.
No, it's fine. There shouldn't run its problems.
Okay. I think one of the things that Brian mentioned, the guy that does the Linux port, was there's kind of one large kernel lock around doing large memory allocations, which was the things hitting him.
That's another problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit of a problem, especially they were hitting some. Well, there was recently a problem on either it was the FreeBSD or the Linux port, I forgot which one, but there was a problem with the way that the kernel memory allocator did. So both platforms have the similar to Lumos have the slab allocator, but they weren't caching slabs above I think 4 or 8K. And since ZFS can easily ask for a slab that's 128K, then they were just falling back to doing a regular sort of kernel malloc. They weren't using the slab cache, so they were just going around looking for a big enough chunk. And yeah, if you do run into some, while you're holding locks and doing that kind of allocation, you can get into some nasty deadlocks, especially if it's a no-sleep allocation.
But there are quite a lot of people using that now, and generally, I think the impression is it's getting a lot more stable than it was. It is still probably the youngest implementation out there. As I mentioned, there's a Revive Mac OS port. There may be some early code to download, but that's kind of not shipping yet. And there's somebody interested in ZFS on Raspberry Pi. I bet there was that. I mean, there have been people running ZFS on Raspberry Pi using the Fuse implementation in the past, but I'm guessing this is rather more of an in-kernel.
That's probably been more of a proof of concept. It can be done.
I mean, actually, the Mac port, or the Mac ports that have existed before, have always had limitations because Macs tend not to have an awful lot of memory. So, for example, they never made things like deduplication code available. This didn't make sense in that sort of environment. I think there are other features of a conscious decision not to support. So the sort of development model, how do we go with OpenZFS? At the moment, there's kind of a Lumos there. FreeBSD being somewhat further ahead, has got most of its changes pushed back into a Lumos. The Linux port's kind of the other way around, so they've been working really hard to get the port done over the last 18 months or so. And there hasn't been a lot of, not a lot of their changes have actually gone back into a Lumos, though that has just started. So I've started seeing the first few going back in. However, when you're working on these platforms, how do you check your code's actually going to work? So you do a code change on Linux, or you do a code change on FreeBSD or a Lumos. You may well think, oh, I'll put that back, and then it blows up on the other platforms. That's kind of not a tenable solution, because if you can't impose on top of a FreeBSD developer, they've got to have Linux, they've got to have a Lumos, and they've got to test their code on all those platforms. So at the moment, if you look at both FreeBSD and Linux, there's kind of a porting layer there, SPL, Solaris porting layer. That kind of provides the kernel interfaces that you find on Solaris and makes those available on FreeBSD. Standard level function calls, at least. The idea here is that, in fact, Lumos will also get a porting layer, hopefully a non-gross porting layer, so it's not one that affects the performance. But then we'll have a completely standard porting layer that ZFS works to. That means that we can actually sort of test the code against a porting layer or against a test suite that runs entirely in user space. So that makes it viable for a ZFS developer running, who's familiar with only one of the platforms, which is going to be the case with most of them, to actually do a really good level of assurance that code changes that they make will work across all of the platforms. There are a few areas where that doesn't work nicely, but on the whole, that will integrate very well with the new test runner and Z-test-based test suites. That's the new framework that replaces STF, the Sun test framework. So kind of sort of drawing to a close now. How to get involved. If you're making a product that's using OpenZFS, or using the open source ZFS, let the team know. Do that again by sort of going through the website I mentioned before. Obviously spread the word, that's what I'm trying to do today, so you can all go out and present this again to all your colleagues. Lots of things, you know, there's always documentation if you're not somebody that actually wants to do coding yourself. Form a local group is another thing. So in fact this is just being looked at, and there's a talk at the moment of forming a ZFS or OpenZFS group in the Bay Area in the States. If there's enough interest, obviously we can do something similar in this country as well. One other thing I mentioned is not on there in terms of documentation. So Kurt McCusick, who's one of the FreeBSD developers, probably best known for developing Berkeley Fast File System, which sort of it's now mostly known as UFS, is actually writing a book on the internals of FreeBSD, and that's got a very large chunk on the internals of ZFS in it. So that will probably be the best sort of published text on the internals of ZFS around when that gets released. So Matt Aarons has been kind of proofreading that for Kirk, and I don't know when that's due to be released, but you know, if you're looking for something that describes the guts of ZFS in sort of current implementations, that's, even if you're not on a FreeBSD, not from FreeBSD's perspective, that's probably a good thing to look for. That brings it to a close. So, any more questions? Yes.
And do you think, you know, so all these companies, you can get ZFS under the umbrella of OpenZFS? I mean, BSD, look on the headline, and I know you say you've got layers in it to try to reporting layers and stuff like that. Do you think eventually you can get them all using the sort of the same source code?
I think that's got to be the aim, and there can't be anyone in any there can't be anyone in any of those companies that doesn't want to do that. It's not like, because it just makes their life so much easier.
But isn't it the way we release open source projects sometimes that the ideas you've listed, some of the great features, in a sense it may be just too damn big.
Oh, a lot of things bigger than ZFS out there. Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, but it's something that I think is very obvious to all of the. I mean, look at it the other way. I won't mention any names, but there's some of the companies that went off and produced ZFS-based products in the early days. They've just gone off and are still running with code bases from 2008 or whatever. And actually, because they haven't put their stuff back, it's not well integrated. It's a nightmare to look after that sort of thing. I mean, there was a bit of a problem for my own company. We're probably the last of the original three who are kind of syncing up with the Lumos code base. But it's a lot of work. And of course, what we have to, we were from somewhat before, but we were having to take all the bug fixes and all the enhancements people want and kind of port them back to an older Open Solaris. That's a nightmare. You can't do that. But we are pretty much synced up now, and that's the same. It's the same issue for any of the companies using ZFS or any of the companies or FreeBSD or Linux. Unless you're going to fork it and go off in a completely, you decide you're not going to follow that, you're going to go off in a different direction. You need a lot of resources to do that.
It would be interesting to make some sort of comparison between that level of development and what's going on within Oracle, the Oracle development of ZFS.
Well, Oracle has got resources to carry on doing that, but there are not many other companies that have that number of developers.
No, I mean the reality at the moment. Can anyone actually make a comparison between the OpenZFS diff from the original free ZFS code and what's available now? Say its current version, was it 35 or 6 or something like that in Oracle 11.1?
I think it's 32, isn't it?
Something like that, I don't remember.
28 was the last sort of...
30 something,
yes, I mean, so of course I can sit down and do that. I mean, I know a number of features. Both of them have got features that the other hasn't. Both of them have taken features from the other one. Yeah. So, it's...
they're in the process of actually getting features from Oracle ZFS to OpenZFS.
No.
We'd love to, if Oracle decided to
This is the
participate.
case, we think this feature is kind of cool, so we may try to implement something similar.
You can re-implement something similar if it I mean, Oracle ZFS is not necessarily aimed at the same customer base as the OpenZFS either.